Hello and welcome to the GCSE Pod Knowledge and Confidence Gap Data Report webinar. In this webinar, we are going to look at what the GCSE Pod Knowledge and Confidence Gap Report is, what we can learn from it, some quick takeaways and some slow burning considerations, and how you might use the report and its data to support your teaching and learning. My name's Emma Slater. I'm the Head of Learning here at Access Education, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined on this webinar by Karen Collins. Karen is an experienced school leader, author, and educational consultant. She's worked a lot with data and has brought an awful lot to this report. Before we get started, it'd be really helpful if you could download the report. You can use the QR code on screen now to do that. I've popped on screen some real key takeaways from the report. So first of all, where are the gaps that we're seeing and what confidence issues are we seeing? So foundation knowledge and skills seem to be a problem area across the curriculum. Writing, both transactional and creative, seem to be gaps in English. Problem solving and knowledge of application, they seem to be areas that we need to focus more on in science and maths. Poor retention of accurate knowledge and facts, well, these came up in history, geography, PE, and business studies. Let me give you a bit of insight into what the report is. So the report provides a high-level overview of student confidence and attainment based on data from our Check and Challenge formative assessment. We have extracted data from the last academic year and encompassing 6.2 million questions answered by over 80,000 GCSE students from across the UK, we feel pretty confident that this gives a really good picture of where there are knowledge gaps and where our students are struggling with confidence. Our aim has been to identify areas of need, and therefore our key markers are percentage of incorrect attempts equaling attainment and percentage of hints used equaling confidence. So less from me. I'm going to now hand over to the recording we've done with Karen, where Karen's really going to dig into the report and how you can better use it. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Karen to talk about our knowledge and confidence report. Karen Collins, she's an experienced school leader, an author, an educational consultant, and the host of podcast Small Screen Science, which I would highly recommend giving a listen to. So Karen, thank you so much for reading through our report, for being a part of supporting us in framing and really thinking about the report. So from your side, with your school leader hat on, what were the high-level takeaways?
I think initially it was really clear that in a number of different subjects, it's that basic foundation knowledge that's not there. A lot of students getting asking for hints or getting answers wrong for these questions where really they should know it because it underpins a lot of the rest of the learning. Now, my background's science, so I noticed in science that it was cells, it was particles, it was energy, fundamental understanding that students need that the rest of the knowledge is built on. And this could be due to, disrupted learning during the pandemic. If their students don't have that basic underpinning knowledge, that's going to impact the rest of their understanding across different subject areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it was also clear in other subjects that actually the basic geographical, the basic history, the basic English knowledge is where the gap is mostly forming. Was there any surprises from the report?
I think the level of application, the inability to apply knowledge, I think I found a little bit surprising. We know students struggle to apply knowledge, but the level of struggle that's clearly there, again, was a little bit surprising. And I think that again could be due to a lack of practice. Maybe, if students aren't in school, it's really difficult to do that retrieval practice and to get them to practice applying that basic knowledge to an application style question. So we know historically application is a problem. I think it's a bigger problem than we've seen previously, in previous reports and examiners' reports.
So thinking about the lack of foundation knowledge across the board, in your mind, you've mentioned COVID, but what else could be underpinning this lack of knowledge for students?
I think it could be, if we're thinking about how we sequence that knowledge in lessons, we spent a lot of time sequencing knowledge, and it may be that that sequencing isn't working for those students. Maybe we're not going back to that foundation knowledge on a more, a frequent enough basis. So our retrieval practice and our interleaving maybe is not up to scratch. And I think it's an opportunity to look back at teaching and learning, I think, and look back at the, that fundamental principles of teaching and learning, where we're thinking about embedding that basic knowledge and returning back to it on a frequent basis. And I think that's something that, predates COVID, because if you look at the 2019 examiners reports, the 2022 examiners reports, the same issues are coming up, the same topic areas are coming up for all different subject areas. And I think if that's the case, if you're finding that, your students are doing poorly on questions which were, on the 2022 examiners reports and the 2019 examiners reports, we need to do something about teaching and learning, something fundamental to that sequencing, interleaving and retrieval practice that we're using in the classroom.
I think there you've just mentioned it, what I would say is a really important takeaway. So if you are a head of department or you are a head of teaching and learning, look at the areas of weakness in your 2019 results, and looking at the examiner's report, look at the examiner's report from 2022 and also your areas of weakness. If they match, and we know they are more of a national trend from the knowledge and confidence report, actually, what are you doing about it? And they're kind of the starter for 10, aren't they, in terms of digging down into looking at that. I think that's really important. And one of the things that is really important to us at GCSE Pod is that we have takeaways from this, that we're not just sort of saying, here's a report, off you go. Now, what about, we know staffing is a real concern in schools at the minute. Could that be playing into anything here?
Could well be, because what tends to happen when you have a shortage of staff is you have your non-specialists teaching Key Stage 3. And again, it's down to that fundamental knowledge. Is there knowledge that's not being acquired at Key Stage 3 that they need for Key Stage 4? So it may be taking a look at the beginning of your GCSE course, working out what is that fundamental knowledge they need to be bringing from Key Stage 3, and just, covering that knowledge initially at the beginning of the course. And I think we're all used to doing that, just a basic recap. But I think now, if you've got staff shortages at Key Stage 3, you really need to think about that in depth. And that also came out in the report, was in certain areas, students struggling with domain-specific vocabulary. And I think that could well be due to understanding at Key Stage 3 as well, where we start to develop this domain-specific language and using appropriate language, specifically using its meaning properly. And students mixing up words which are very similar to each other. That came up in a number of different subject areas. And I think that's worth considering as well, vocabulary that they're bringing from Key Stage 3 into Key Stage 4.
And I wonder if, again, if you're a head of department, thinking use this report as a tool for good to be able to go to your SLT or to go to your team and say, look, we can see where the gaps and where we're falling into, we match these confidence gaps, we match these gaps in knowledge. What are we doing at Key Stage 3? I suppose the challenge fundamentally there is we're talking about, theoretically what everyone could do. If at the moment you're in a situation where staffing or staff sickness is so high that you are teaching large classes, 2-3 classes in a hall at the same time, that tends to fall into your Key Stage 3 space, doesn't it? It tends to be Key Stage 3 that suffers in that. So would you say, if that's your situation, looking at this knowledge and confidence report and thinking there are definitely gaps that are travelling up from Key Stage 3, what would be your recommendation? What sort of, is there any tools, anything you've seen done really well, like really good practice you've seen when you've been working with schools?
Yeah, I think it's all about this retrieval practice and effective retrieval practice. I think sometimes we fall into a bit of a rut with retrieval practice. It's like, I'm going to have one question from a month ago, one question from 2 weeks ago, one question from last week. And actually, we need to be thinking about it in much more depth than that. So if you're teaching a Key Stage 4 topic area, for example, and you know there's underpinning knowledge from earlier in Key Stage 4 or in Key Stage 3, you know, looking at that, thinking about how can I weave that in between, you know, what's essential for them to know at the beginning of the topic? Can I spend 15 minutes at the beginning of the topic recapping essential knowledge that I know they need for the rest of the topic, and then interleave or retrieve the other remaining knowledge that I know they need from Key Stage 3 as we go through the topic, and keep going back to Key Stage 3 where it's needed. And I think sometimes we're so focused on getting through all of that knowledge and content from Key Stage 4, because we know there's a lot of it, that we forget that they're not going to understand it. They're not going to be able to apply it effectively if they don't have this fundamental underpinning knowledge. And we know that we can't cover the whole of Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. There's not enough time. So we have to really look at what's absolutely fundamental. What do we absolutely need to cover for them to be able to understand or apply this Key Stage 4 knowledge and understanding?
Yeah, and I think so. That would lead me on to, you know, a sort of, I always feel like in all of these conversations, a bit of an elephant in the room is the amount of content. And it's not subject specific across the board in all of our GCSE subjects now. The amount of content expected to be covered is huge. And could it be that that is part of the issue and concern? And actually, COVID has made that worse for sure. But really, it comes down to the way that the GCSE is at the moment.
Yeah, and that is a problem, but it is a problem that we're all facing. So I think that's worth considering, is that we are on a level playing field from that perspective. So as schools, we're all struggling with the same issues. And I know that absence has been a problem in, you know, different areas of the country. Absence has been different, just because of the way that COVID spread. But you know, we're all dealing with the same problem of the quantity of knowledge. And I think it is all about that sequencing. And, you know, and it is all about building knowledge upon knowledge. And I think this is where the application may have become a problem, because we're so focused on giving them the knowledge and making sure they've got it. We forget that in examinations, they also need to apply it, and we need to put practice in at applying it. And I think sometimes we're also so focused about, let's get through the content as quickly as we can by, you know, January, February, March, and then we'll do revision from that point onwards. And I do think we need to reconsider that, because you know, if they're not understanding it and embedding it when we first teach it, then trying to retrieve it again in February, March and April is going to be so difficult for them. And we need to consider that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't, if it's not there originally and you're seeing those gaps, and you have a report in front of you saying, look, this is a bit of a national issue, and you recognise that in your students, you know, it really... do you have to be brave and put the brakes on and go, we cannot move forward until you understand this foundation stuff, because that really is, you know, the foundation that we're building all of this other knowledge on top of. Would you give any other advice? Maybe we've talked a lot about sort of head of departments. I think I've suggested a few things. Would you give any SLT advice? So if you're SLT and you've got this report, what would your takeaways be, or what would you try to do?
I think as SLT, I think individual conversations with heads of department to see if those themes and trends are an issue in your own school. I think that's key, because I think those conversations need to be had, and they can be quite powerful. And then it's about how can you support those heads of department to deliver. So is there anything they need? And I think sometimes we forget we do have little pockets of time during the day where we can do support. You know, if you've got time during tutor where you can look at domain specific vocabulary, that could be huge support to your, you know, to your heads of department. If you've got activities where you're supporting tier 2 vocabulary as well, really important, where students often don't understand an examination question because of the tier 2 vocabulary covered. Now, the questions that we have at GCSE pod are worded in a way where that carrier language, that language which is around the domain specific language, is designed to not impede student progress. But we know when you get to examinations, there may well be tier 2 language which block the students from being able to answer the question. And I think that's really key. So there's really small things that we can do as a leadership team that can support a heads of department. So find out from your heads of department if there are little things like that that could be done during PSHE time, could be done during tutor time, that could support students overall with their learning. Because what you'll probably find is there's commonalities across subjects, and that's what you can look for. Because if they're having a certain issue in mathematics, that may well impact on geography, history, DT. And, you know, if you can deal with that fundamental issue, you can help all those subjects. We know, for example, that students struggle with inference at Key Stage 2, and inference has impact on lots of different subject areas. I mean, again, talking as a scientist, if you can't infer, you struggle to draw conclusions from data. And that's huge. So, you know, if we can deal with inference during tutor time, that will support a large number of subject areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as an English teacher, that it you know, inference is a huge part of everything we do. But you're right, they come up with a struggle within that space, a struggle to interpret, and actually, I think often you can be siloed into your own department, can't you? And you can forget that actually, if they can't infer here, how do they replicate that skill elsewhere? And I think there's also, what I find really interesting about the report is it's not just around, I mean, there is knowledge gaps of the fundamental foundation knowledge, but there also seems to be skills gaps. And I think those skills gaps travel and move between the different subjects. So before we started recording this webinar, we had a quick chat about multiple choice questions, because you made a very valuable point that actually, obviously, this data is based on multiple choice questions. I mean, we do have millions of responses that we are using, so we feel confident in the data. But would you just sort of give our listeners a quick roundup of actually why and how multiple choice questions can be a valuable tool, especially our Chicken Challenge multiple choice questions?
Yeah, I think sometimes when we think about multiple choice questions, we think, oh, it's fine because they'll be able to guess the answer. And actually, it, you know, is that going to tell us much? And I think sometimes we have a lot of misperceptions and misunderstandings about multiple choice questions. So a good multiple choice question that goes through the systems that we have, you know, a GCSE pod, has got distractors, which are common misconceptions or common misunderstandings or common wrong answers. So a good example would be, you know, if a calculation question asked a student to calculate to 2 significant figures, then the common distractors or the incorrect answers would be an answer to 2 decimal places, for example, because students often mix up significant figures and decimal places. There'll be answers where the numbers have been rounded up incorrectly because students struggle to round up numbers correctly. So, you know, a lot of thought has gone into those distractors. What also happens is we think very carefully about the language. So the difficulty of the question is about how the domain knowledge is difficult. So the geography, history, English knowledge, and how difficult that is. But the carrier language, so that's the language of the question itself, is designed to be accessible. So students are getting a question wrong, not because they don't understand the question, but because they don't understand the knowledge, the geography, history, or English knowledge that they have. And I think that's really, really important. And, you know, some of the questions will be understanding-based questions and recall-based questions, but others do involve application. And if students are doing poorly on those questions, you can, you know, burrow down into them and try and work out, well, do they have the knowledge because they got that question right, but they can't apply it to a new situation because they got that question wrong. And I think that's the sequencing of multiple choice questions within GCSE pod is really good at that, because, you know, the sequencing is there. So you get the lower attaining students being able to answer the first few questions, and then they get increasingly more difficult as you go through the questions, but also jump backwards and forwards as well. There's a little bit of interleaving of difficulty, and that's important. And that gives you quite a lot of information, actually. So yeah, so multiple choice questions really can be a really valuable way of using low stakes assessment to find out whether students know and can apply the knowledge that they have.
Yeah, and absolutely. One of the things that we see across the board with regards to confidence is where students ask for hints. You know, we often, with some of the what would be a higher paper topic, we often get more hints asked for, but then they go on to get the right answer. So the knowledge is there somewhere, but the confidence isn't there. Equally, we often see it as well at the very foundation topics. So in maths, at some of the very, very basic foundation topics, lots of hints being asked for. And you know, I think we can take from that actually the fundamentally the knowledge is there, because they often then go on to get it right. But there's a low confidence within that subject, even at the most foundation, you know, the most foundation knowledge topics, or topics that are very, very commonly on the foundation paper.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really interesting, because I think a lack of confidence in the students is, again, something that SLT can help support, is, you know, talking students through examination preparation, helping them, you know, in terms of their confidence in particular subjects. You know, you can absolutely do this. You do know it. And, you know, and working on that again during tutor time, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah. I think one of the points you made to me earlier that I also found really interesting was that a lot of what the report is showing us is linked to just consistent and ongoing concerns, shall we say. We're doing the report again before the exam, so we're going to, once mocks have happened and we always see a real peak in questions answered, we are going to analyze the data again. In your mind, would you expect to see a great amount of difference between what students are doing maybe earlier in the year as they head towards GCSEs, or what they start to see just before they sort of go through their GCSEs?
Ironically, I think it will be a bit of a mix, because we know that in 2019 and 2022, across a range of subjects, the same subject areas are coming up as problematic. And that suggests that something fundamental needs to change in terms of teaching and learning, and clearly hasn't, because we've not looked back at how we teach those particular subjects and changed the way we do it. So I think some of those fundamental topics may well appear again, but I think some of the others, where they're quite unusual, and normally students are able to answer those questions, they don't come up in classic examiners' reports. I would expect to see an improvement in those between the two reports.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we'll have you back, I'm sure. Just somewhere that we're doing the report again. It will be released sort of once all of the mocks have been marked, but certainly before Easter, when we go into real revision time. Thank you so much, Karen. Really appreciate you coming to dig into this report and to give your professional view. Thank you.
Thank you.
A massive thank you again to Karen for taking part in this webinar, for sharing her insight into the report and how we might better use it. In case you didn't catch the QR code at the beginning of the webinar, here it is again, and here are some of the key takeaways in bullet points, just so you feel informed of how you're going to take things forward in these areas. Thank you for joining us, and please do make sure you sign up to any of our future GCSE Pod webinars. Thank you. Goodbye.